If you wanted to pinpoint the moment the Roman Republic stopped being a system and started becoming a prize, you could do far worse than one hot August day in 48 BCE on a dusty plain near Pharsalus in central Greece. This was not Rome versus Carthage, or Rome versus Gaul, or some foreign king at the edge of the map. This was Roman against Roman, eagle against eagle, and two men standing at the center of the storm. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, once Rome's most celebrated commander, and Gaius Julius Caesar, the brilliant, dangerous general who refused to surrender his command and trust his enemies in the Senate. To understand why Pharsalus mattered so much, you have to wind back a few years. Rome had grown faster than its republican machinery could handle. Elections were violent, courts were political weapons, and generals increasingly owed their power to loyal armies more than to constitutional tradition. Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus had once managed this chaos through a private alliance, the First Triumvirate. It was less a legal institution than an agreement among powerful men to stop blocking each other and start dividing influence. It worked for a while. Then Crassus died in Parthia, and the balance collapsed. Caesar, after his campaigns in Gaul, had become extraordinarily wealthy, famous, and feared. Pompey, meanwhile, moved closer to the conservative elite in Rome, many of whom viewed Caesar as an existential threat. The political question soon became brutally simple. Could Caesar return to Rome without being prosecuted and politically destroyed? Caesar wanted to keep imperium, legal command authority, until he could secure office and safety. His enemies wanted him disarmed first. In January 49 BCE, Caesar chose force over submission and crossed the Rubicon with troops. That act turned a constitutional crisis into civil war. The early phases moved quickly. Pompey and many senators withdrew from Italy rather than fight immediately under unfavorable conditions. Caesar seized Rome, then rushed to Spain to defeat Pompeian legions there. He returned, secured political legitimacy on his own terms, and then crossed into the Balkans to confront Pompey directly. The campaign that followed was grueling and uncertain. Pompey had naval superiority, stronger access to supplies, and large manpower reserves from Rome's eastern networks. Caesar had speed, audacity, and veterans hardened by years of campaigning. Then came a major reverse for Caesar at Dyrrhachium. He was outmaneuvered, pressured, and forced to disengage. For many observers, that should have been the beginning of the end. But Caesar did what great commanders do after a setback. He preserved his army, moved fast, and refused the psychological defeat his enemies expected. He marched into Thessaly, took badly needed supplies, and restored confidence among his troops. Pompey followed. Both armies maneuvered, probed, and waited. Around them hung the unspoken truth everyone understood. One decisive battle could settle the war. By the time they faced each other near Pharsalus, Pompey had the numerical edge, especially in cavalry. His supporters were confident, in some cases overconfident. They believed Caesar's army was exhausted, outnumbered, and living on borrowed luck. Caesar's men were fewer, but they were veterans who trusted their commander and each other. This was not just a clash of numbers, it was a clash of military cultures. Coalition mass and aristocratic expectation on one side, campaign-tested cohesion and adaptive command on the other. The morning of battle arrived with heat, dust, and tension thick enough to taste. Thousands of men stood in formation, knowing that by sunset, Rome's political future would belong to whichever army held the field. In theory, both sides fought for the Republic. In reality, the Republic had already reached the point where it could only be argued by steel. Pompey's plan for Pharsalus was straightforward and, on paper, intelligent. He knew he held a major advantage in cavalry. On his left flank, he massed horsemen and light troops with a clear mission: smash Caesar's weaker cavalry on Caesar's right, swing around, and hit Caesar's infantry flank and rear. If that worked, Caesar's smaller army would likely collapse in stages, first by disorder, then by panic. Pompey also instructed much of his infantry to hold their ground and receive Caesar's charge, aiming to drain momentum from the attackers before close combat began. Caesar saw exactly where the danger lay. He understood that if Pompey's cavalry rolled up his right flank, the battle could be lost regardless of what happened in the center. So he made one of the most famous tactical adjustments of the ancient world. He quietly pulled selected cohorts from his rear line and positioned them as a concealed reserve behind his vulnerable right. Their job was not routine support. Their job was to wait, hold nerve, and strike at precisely the moment Pompey believed victory was already secured. When the lines advanced, discipline mattered immediately. Caesar's infantry moved forward at pace, then, seeing Pompey's men standing still, paused briefly to catch breath and reform before the final rush. It was a tiny detail with huge implications. These were not troops running blind on emotion, but soldiers capable of control in the seconds before impact. Then came the crash of pila, shields, and bodies. The center became a brutal shove of iron, wood, and muscle. On Caesar's right, Pompey's cavalry began to do exactly what it was supposed to do. They pushed Caesar's horsemen back and opened space to envelop. For a moment, Pompey's design looked perfect. This was the point where many battles are decided by expectation. One side senses the plan is working and leans in. The other senses disaster and breaks. Caesar chose that exact moment to release his hidden cohorts. What happened next was sudden and violent. Instead of fleeing infantry or scattered cavalry, Pompey's cavalry met compact ranks of fresh legionaries driving hard at close quarters. Ancient accounts describe Caesar's men targeting faces and eyes, a terrifying method against mounted troops who relied on speed and psychological dominance. The effect was immediate. Pompey's cavalry lost coherence, then nerve, then the field. The very force meant to win the battle became a wave of flight. Once Pompey's left flank collapsed, the geometry of the entire battle changed in minutes. Caesar's reserve and supporting units turned inward and struck exposed infantry. Caesar also committed fresh troops from his third line at a moment when front-rank fighters on both sides were already exhausted. Fatigue, flank pressure, and collapsing confidence combined like dry tinder and a spark. Pompey's infantry began to give ground, then fall apart in segments. In ancient warfare, rout is less a single event than a chain reaction. Men see neighboring standards retreat, hear contradictory orders, lose sight of cavalry support, and suddenly the logic of staying in line evaporates. That chain reaction moved through Pompey's army at Pharsalus with terrible speed. Units that had stood firm moments earlier now streamed back toward camp or sought escape routes off the field. Pompey himself, watching his cavalry scatter and his line unravel, withdrew. The commander once called the Great now faced a reality no title could fix. His army was failing, and the battle for Rome was slipping out of his hands. Caesar, meanwhile, did what winning generals do. He did not pause to celebrate. He pressed. Caesar drove his men toward Pompey's camp, and then beyond, turning a battlefield victory into operational collapse for the enemy. Fighting continued in and around fortified positions, with exhausted troops forced onward because momentum was everything. By controlling key approaches and pressuring retreating concentrations, Caesar denied Pompeian forces time to reorganize. Large numbers surrendered rather than die in place. Others scattered. Ancient casualty numbers vary wildly, as they often do. Caesar reports remarkably low losses for his own side and heavy losses for Pompey, with vast numbers captured. Other ancient writers offer different totals. Modern historians treat all precise figures cautiously, but the broad conclusion is clear and widely accepted. Pharsalus was decisive, and Pompey's field army ceased to function as a coherent force. In Civil War terms, that matters more than any exact body count. Armies can be rebuilt from survivors. Legitimacy is harder to recover once your best army has broken in full view of the Roman world. Caesar's behavior after the battle is one of the most discussed features of the campaign. He presented himself as merciful toward surrendered Roman opponents, a policy often called clemency. This was partly personal style, partly propaganda, and partly strategy. Mercy could peel away resistance, encourage defections, and paint Caesar not as a destroyer of Rome, but as a restorer under new management. It did not erase the bloodshed, but it helped him govern victory.
Pompey fled east, trying to find a base from which to continue the war. He still had name recognition, networks, and some remaining allies, but he had lost what mattered most, a battle-worthy core army under his direct command. He sailed east toward Egypt, where he hoped old ties would provide refuge. Instead, he was murdered on arrival by courtiers around the young Ptolemy XIII, who thought presenting Pompey dead would win favor with Caesar. It was a shocking end for one of Rome's greatest commanders, and a brutal reminder that in power politics, yesterday's ally can become today's bargaining chip. Caesar pursued quickly and arrived in Egypt soon after. According to later accounts, he was appalled when shown Pompey's severed head. Whether that reaction was entirely personal, partly political, or both, the symbolism was immense. The man who had once dominated Roman politics and defeated kings across 3 continents did not die at the head of a triumphant army. He died as an exile, cut down by opportunists in a foreign court, while the republic he claimed to defend fractured behind him. Still, Pharsalus did not magically end all fighting. Pompeian resistance continued in other theaters, and Caesar had to campaign again in Egypt, North Africa, and Spain before the war was truly finished. But Pharsalus changed the structure of the conflict. After 48 BCE, opposition to Caesar remained dangerous, yet fragmented, lacking a single leader with Pompey's stature and a comparable mass army ready for immediate decisive battle. The deeper significance of Pharsalus lies in what it revealed about Rome's political system. The Republic still had magistrates, elections, senatorial debates, and legal forms. But those forms had lost their ability to contain elite rivalry once armies became personal instruments of power. Pharsalus showed that constitutional arguments could now be settled by field command, veteran loyalty, and tactical innovation. The language of republican legitimacy survived, the distribution of coercive power did not. In that sense, Pharsalus is not just a military episode, it is a case study in state transformation under pressure. Institutions rarely collapse in a single dramatic instant. More often, they thin out, fail to resolve repeated crises, and eventually yield to whoever can impose order by force. On the plain near Pharsalus, that process became impossible to ignore.
So why did Caesar win, despite being outnumbered and fresh from a recent setback? First, he identified the decisive point of failure before it happened. He knew Pompey's cavalry superiority was the hinge and built a specific counter for it. Second, his army executed under pressure with veteran discipline, controlled advance, timed reserve commitment, sustained pursuit. Third, Caesar converted tactical success into strategic acceleration. He didn't just win the line, he shattered the enemy's ability to continue as a unified force. Pompey was not a fool, and Pharsalus was not inevitable. His plan could have worked, and for a short phase it did. But battle rewards adaptation in real time, not merely good design before first contact. Caesar proved more flexible at the critical moment. Pompey's coalition, crowded with political expectations and competing voices, proved less resilient when the script broke. There is also a human layer to the battle that numbers can't capture. These were Roman citizens killing Roman citizens in organized formations, each side convinced it was saving the Republic from the other. Officers recognized faces across the field. Veterans who had once served common causes now met as enemies. Civil war corrodes memory as much as institutions. It turns yesterday's oath into today's accusation. After Pharsalus, Caesar's path to supreme power was not smooth, but it was open. He would eventually be appointed dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, concentrating authority in ways the old republican system had not been built to absorb. His assassination in 44 BCE did not restore the old order. It triggered another cycle of civil wars that ended with Octavian, later Augustus, and the birth of the Principate. In that long chain, Pharsalus stands as the moment one crucial counterweight fell away. That is why the battle keeps returning in books, documentaries, and debates. Not because every ancient source agrees,
and not because the battlefield details are free from controversy. It endures because it asks a timeless question. What happens when a political system can no longer make binding decisions without military force? Rome's answer at Pharsalus was stark. Once trust in shared rules collapses, victory goes to the side that can combine legitimacy claims with effective violence faster than its rival. Picture the scene at day's end. The heat still hangs over the plain. Broken shields, abandoned standards, and bodies mark where formations held and failed. Survivors drift toward camps, rivers, hills, or surrender lines. Messengers run with news that will race across the Mediterranean by ship and rumor. Pompey defeated, Caesar victorious, the balance broken. In Rome itself, people will argue over what this means, over whether this is rescue or ruin, over whether the republic can still be called a republic. But the soldiers who stood at Pharsalus understand first. Whatever the Senate says next, power has moved. And maybe that is the final lesson of Pharsalus. History is not only shaped by laws written in chambers, it is also shaped by fear, ambition, logistics, fatigue, and split-second decisions on open ground. At Pharsalus, one commander saw the trap before it closed, one army held together a little longer, and one political world tipped into another. The Republic did not vanish in a single afternoon, but on that afternoon, its future narrowed, and the road toward imperial rule became far harder to avoid. When we remember Pharsalus, we are not just remembering who beat whom. We are watching a constitutional order cross a threshold. We are watching a society discover that it has trained men to conquer everyone except themselves. And we are watching, in the dust and noise of one battle, the beginning of Rome's next age. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe.